Hello everyone, and welcome back. Before we start, I need you to understand something about this case. This isn't just another murder mystery. This is a story about psychological terror that lasted for years. About a killer who didn't just take a life, he tortured an entire family for 4 years after the murder. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button now. This channel is dedicated to deep investigations into cases where evil doesn't just strike once and disappear. Cases where the cruelty continues long after the victim is gone. And this case? The killer wanted everyone to know he'd won. He wanted to gloat. He wanted to make sure the family never had peace. And he succeeded. Imagine this: your phone rings. You answer. A man's voice says, "Is Dorothy there?" You tell him she's missing, she's been gone for a week. The man responds, "I know. I have her." And then he hangs up. The next week, the phone rings again. Same voice. "She's dead. I killed her." Click. The week after that. Ring. "Is Dorothy home yet?" Click. Week after week after week. For 4 years. Every Wednesday. Like clockwork. The killer calling to remind the family that he'd taken their daughter, their sister, their mother. And there was nothing they could do about it. This happened. This is real. This is the story of Dorothy Jane Scott. May 28, 1980. Anaheim, California. Dorothy Jane Scott is at work late, attending an employee meeting at the small custom products company where she works as a secretary. It's around 9 p.m. The meeting is routine, boring even. Then one of her coworkers, Conrad Bostron, mentions he's not feeling well. His arm is swollen, red, painful. He thinks maybe an insect bit him earlier in the day. Within minutes, the swelling gets worse. His arm is turning dark red. Someone recognizes the symptoms: black widow spider bite. This is serious. This is hospital now serious. Dorothy doesn't hesitate. She volunteers to drive Conrad and another coworker, Pam Head, to the emergency room at UCI Medical Center in Orange. It's the kind of thing Dorothy does. She's helpful. She's responsible. She's the person everyone can count on. They take Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon. Conrad sits in front, in pain. Pam sits in back. Dorothy drives carefully through the night, getting Conrad to the ER just after 10 p.m. At the hospital, while Conrad is being treated, Dorothy mentions she needs to stop by her parents' house quickly. It's nearby. She just wants to check on them, maybe change clothes. She's wearing a black scarf that evening, and she wants to swap it for a red one. Small detail. Insignificant, right? She drives to her parents' home. 15 minutes, maybe 20. She changes her scarf, checks that everything is okay, and returns to the hospital. Conrad is still being treated. Pam is waiting. Everything is fine. Normal. Just a strange Wednesday night helping a coworker. Around 11 p.m., Conrad is released. The doctors have treated him, given him medication, told him to follow up with his regular doctor. He'll be okay. Time to go home. Dorothy tells Conrad and Pam to wait by the entrance while she goes to get her car from the parking lot. The lot is dark, not well lit. She walks alone to her Toyota station wagon. Conrad and Pam stand by the hospital entrance, waiting. They see headlights approaching from the parking lot. Dorothy's white Toyota, distinctive and familiar. The car is coming toward them. But it doesn't stop. Instead, the car suddenly accelerates. The engine revs. The headlights blind Conrad and Pam for a moment. The Toyota speeds past them, through the hospital circle drive, and onto the main road. Gone. Conrad and Pam stand there, confused. What just happened? Why did Dorothy just drive away? That doesn't make any sense. Dorothy wouldn't just leave them stranded. That's not who she is. They wait. Maybe she's coming back. Maybe she forgot something. Maybe there's an explanation. She doesn't come back. By midnight, they're genuinely worried. They call Dorothy's parents. Have you heard from Dorothy? No, they haven't. She left their house over an hour ago to return to the hospital. By 1 a.m., Dorothy's family is frantic. Something is wrong. Dorothy wouldn't disappear like this. She wouldn't leave her coworkers stranded. She has a 4-year-old son at home. She would never just vanish. By 5 a.m. on May 29, 1980, Dorothy's white Toyota station wagon is found in an alley off Beach Boulevard in Santa Ana, about 10 miles from the hospital. The car is on fire. Flames consuming the interior, destroying evidence, turning everything inside to ash and twisted metal. Firefighters extinguish the blaze. Police examine what's left. The car is registered to Dorothy Jane Scott. But Dorothy is nowhere to be found. She has vanished. Completely. Without explanation. Without a trace. But here's what makes this case truly horrifying: Dorothy didn't disappear without warning. She'd known this was coming. She'd been telling people for months that someone was stalking her. Someone who called her repeatedly. Someone who alternated between professing love and making death threats. Someone who said, "When I get you alone, I'm going to cut you into pieces so small that no one will ever find you." Dorothy knew she was being hunted. She just didn't know by whom. She recognized the voice on the phone but couldn't place it. Couldn't identify him. Couldn't protect herself. And now she was gone. 1 week later, the phone rang at Dorothy's parents' home. Her mother, Vera, answered. "Is this a relative of Dorothy Scott?" a man's voice asked. "Yes," Vera replied, her heart racing. "Do you know where she is?" "I have her," the man said. And then he hung up. That was the first call. There would be hundreds more over the next 4 years. Every week. Sometimes multiple times a week. The killer calling to Gloat, to Torment, to make sure the family never forgot what he'd done. This is the complete story of Dorothy Jane Scott. A woman who knew death was coming for her. A family that was tortured for years by her killer. And a case that remains unsolved 45 years later because the one person who knows the truth has never been identified. Her name was Dorothy Jane Scott. She was 32 years old. She was a mother, a daughter, a devoted Christian who believed in goodness and kindness. And someone took all of that away from her, then spent 4 years bragging about it. We begin. Before we can understand the terror that consumed Dorothy Scott's final months, before we can comprehend the evil that took her life, you need to know who she was. Because Dorothy wasn't just a victim of a stalker and murderer. She was a real person with depth, character, and a life she'd built with care and purpose. Dorothy Jane Scott was born on April 23, 1948, in Brooksville, Pennsylvania, a small town in the western part of the state. She was the daughter of Jacob and Vera Scott, hardworking people who instilled in their daughter values of responsibility, faith, and compassion. Growing up in Pennsylvania in the 1950s and early 60s, Dorothy was by all accounts a sweet, quiet child. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, but she had a presence. People were drawn to her kindness, her willingness to help, her genuine interest in others' well-being. Dorothy's childhood friends remember her as thoughtful. She was the kind of girl who remembered your birthday, who asked about your sick grandmother, who included the lonely kid in playground games. She had an innate sense of fairness and justice. If something wasn't right, Dorothy would speak up, even as a child. In her teenage years, Dorothy developed a deep faith in Christianity. This wasn't performative religion. Dorothy truly believed in the teachings of Jesus Christ: love your neighbor, help the poor, turn the other cheek, forgive those who wrong you. These principles would guide her entire life. After graduating high school in the mid-1960s, Dorothy made a decision that would define the next chapter of her life: she was moving to California. The pull of the West Coast was strong in that era. California represented opportunity, sunshine, a fresh start. For a young woman from a small Pennsylvania town, it was a chance to build something new. Dorothy moved to Southern California, settling initially in the Los Angeles area before eventually making her way to Orange County. This was California in its golden age, the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the region was exploding with growth, opportunity, and cultural change. In California, Dorothy met a man. She fell in love. She married. And in 1976, at the age of 28, she gave birth to a son, Sean Scott. Motherhood transformed Dorothy. Everything she did from that moment forward was filtered through the lens of being Sean's mother. But the marriage didn't last. By the time Sean was a toddler, Dorothy and her husband had separated and eventually divorced. This was difficult for Dorothy, both emotionally and practically. Divorce in the 1970s carried more stigma than it does today, especially in religious communities. And being a single mother was financially challenging. But Dorothy was determined to make it work. She wasn't going to let her circumstances define her son's future. Sean would have a good life, a stable home, a mother who was present and loving. Dorothy made that her mission. By 1980, Dorothy had established a stable, if modest, life. She lived with her aunt, sharing an apartment in Stanton, California, a working-class community in Orange County. This arrangement worked well for everyone. Dorothy had help with childcare. Her aunt had company and someone to share expenses. And Sean had a loving home with two devoted women caring for him. Dorothy's parents, Jacob and Vera, had also moved to California by this point, settling in Anaheim. They were deeply involved in Dorothy's and Sean's lives. Jacob, Dorothy's father, was protective of his daughter. He worried about her. A single mother, working, trying to make ends meet, he wanted better for her. But he was proud of how hard she worked, how devoted she was to Sean. Vera, Dorothy's mother, was her closest confidant. They spoke nearly every day. Dorothy would call her mother to talk about work, about Sean, about life's small joys and frustrations. They had the kind of relationship every mother hopes to have with an adult daughter, friendship mixed with unconditional love. Professionally, Dorothy worked as a secretary at Custom John Enterprises, later renamed Swinger's Psych Shop, a small company in Anaheim that manufactured custom products. It wasn't glamorous work, but Dorothy was good at it. She was organized, reliable, detail-oriented. Her boss and coworkers appreciated her work ethic. The company was a bit unusual. Psych Shop was 1970s California slang. The business catered to the counterculture crowd, making custom items, had shop supplies, that sort of thing. It wasn't Dorothy's world personally. She didn't drink, didn't do drugs, didn't partake in the party scene that many of her coworkers enjoyed. But she wasn't judgmental. She did her job professionally and kept her personal life separate. Dorothy's coworkers describe her as pleasant but private. She was friendly, would chat about safe topics, would help anyone who needed assistance. But she didn't share much about her personal life. She didn't go to happy hours or social events. She'd work her shift, then go home to her son. That was her priority. Outside of work and motherhood, Dorothy's life centered on her faith. She attended church regularly, often bringing Sean with her. She read the Bible. She prayed. She tried to live according to Christian principles even when it was difficult. Dorothy was also health conscious in a way that was ahead of her time. She didn't drink alcohol, never had, as far as family and friends could remember. She didn't smoke. She was careful about what she ate, preferring home-cooked meals to fast food. She walked for exercise when she could. In early 1980, Dorothy decided to take her physical preparedness to another level. She enrolled in a karate class. This wasn't about becoming a martial arts expert. Dorothy wanted to know how to defend herself. She wanted to feel capable, strong, able to protect herself if necessary. Why? Because something had been happening that made Dorothy feel unsafe. The phone calls had started months earlier, probably in late 1979 or very early 1980. At first, they were just strange. The phone would ring. Dorothy would answer. A man's voice would say, "I love you, Dorothy." Dorothy would ask, "Who is this?" The man would hang up. This happened repeatedly. Always the same voice. Always some variation of, "I love you," or "I'm watching you," or "I think about you all the time." Dorothy was disturbed but tried to dismiss it as a prank, maybe a wrong number, maybe some weirdo who'd gotten her number randomly. She changed her phone number. The calls stopped for a while. But then they started again. The caller had somehow gotten her new number. This wasn't random. Someone was specifically targeting her. The calls became more frequent and more disturbing. The professions of love were mixed with anger. "Why don't you love me, Dorothy? You belong to me. I'm going to have you." Dorothy started to recognize something about the voice. It was familiar. Not like a close friend or family member, but familiar the way a customer's voice might be familiar, or someone she'd spoken to casually. She couldn't place it exactly, but there was something she recognized. This terrified her more than if the voice had been completely unknown. It meant this person knew her. Had interacted with her. Maybe regularly. And she couldn't figure out who it was. Dorothy confided in her family about the calls. She told her parents. She told her aunt. She told a few close friends. Everyone was concerned, but what could be done? In 1980, stalking wasn't well understood. Law enforcement didn't take these things as seriously as they would today. Without a specific threat, without knowing who was calling, there wasn't much police could do. Then the calls escalated from disturbing to terrifying. "When I get you alone, Dorothy, I'm going to cut you into bits and pieces so small that no one will ever find you." That specific threat. Graphic. Violent. Detailed. This wasn't someone playing games. This was someone with a plan. Dorothy was frightened. She started varying her routine. She was careful about when she came and went from her apartment. She made sure she wasn't alone in parking lots or isolated areas. She was vigilant. But vigilance can only go so far when you don't know who the threat is. One day, Dorothy walked out to her car in the parking lot where she worked. There, on her windshield, was a single dead rose. Black, wilted, deliberately placed. No note. No explanation. Just a dead rose. Dorothy knew immediately what it meant. The caller had placed it there. He'd been at her work. He knew where she worked. He'd been close enough to touch her car. She told her coworkers about it. She showed them the rose. Everyone agreed it was creepy, but again, what could be done? Call the police? And tell them what? Someone left a dead flower on her car? It wasn't illegal. Dorothy started to seriously consider buying a gun. She'd never owned one, had never wanted one, but she was genuinely afraid for her life. She spoke to her father about it. Jacob was concerned but not sure a gun was the answer. What if Sean got hold of it? What if Dorothy wasn't trained properly? Instead of a gun, Dorothy had signed up for those karate classes. She wanted to feel less helpless. She'd been attending for about a month by May 1980. She was learning basic self-defense moves, building confidence, getting stronger. But karate couldn't protect her from what was coming. In the weeks leading up to May 28, the calls had continued. Sometimes they were love confessions. Sometimes they were threats. The callers seemed to alternate between delusion and rage. He'd say he loved her, that they belonged together, that she was his. Then he'd say she'd betrayed him, that she deserved to die, that he'd make her pay. Dorothy had never betrayed anyone. She hadn't been dating. She'd been focused on her son and her work. Whatever relationship this caller imagined they had existed only in his mind. But delusion is powerful. And dangerous. When someone believes something so completely, when they've constructed an entire reality around their obsession, facts don't matter. Dorothy's actual life, her choices, her relationships, her feelings, were irrelevant to this man's fantasy. To her family and friends, Dorothy seemed increasingly stressed in those final weeks. She was jumpy. She'd startle at unexpected sounds. She was checking over her shoulder constantly. The carefree, peaceful woman they'd known was being eroded by constant fear. Vera, Dorothy's mother, tried to convince her daughter to move back in with them. Come stay at the house, at least temporarily, until this blows over. But Dorothy didn't want to put her parents in danger. What if the caller followed her there? What if he escalated? Dorothy felt trapped. She couldn't hide. She couldn't run. She couldn't identify her stalker. All she could do was be careful, be vigilant, and hope that whoever this was would eventually get bored and move on. On May 28, 1980, Dorothy went to work as usual. She wore jeans and a casual top, appropriate for the employee meeting that evening. She wore a black scarf around her neck, a simple accessory. It was a normal day. She answered phones, typed documents, filed paperwork. Her coworkers remember her seeming okay that day. Not particularly anxious. Not different from usual. The meeting that evening was routine. Employee updates, company policy changes, nothing remarkable. Just one of those mandatory meetings that could have been an email, as people say today. When Conrad Bostron realized he'd been bitten by a black widow spider and needed emergency medical attention, Dorothy's helpful nature kicked in immediately. Of course she'd drive him to the hospital. Of course she'd stay with him. That's who Dorothy was. She had no idea that this act of kindness would lead her directly to her killer. Because someone was watching. Someone who knew her routine, knew her car, knew she'd be at that meeting. Someone who saw an opportunity when Dorothy went alone into that dark hospital parking lot. What Dorothy didn't know, couldn't know, was that her stalker wasn't just making threats anymore. He'd made his plan. And tonight was the night he was going to execute it. The last time Dorothy Scott was seen alive by people who cared about her, she was walking into a hospital parking lot to get her car. Helpful. Responsible. The same Dorothy everyone had always known. She never walked out of that parking lot. To understand how Dorothy Scott's murder unfolded, we need to examine in detail the months of psychological torture that preceded it. Because what happened to Dorothy wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was the culmination of an obsession that had been building for months, possibly longer. The phone calls began sometime in late 1979, though the exact date is unclear. Dorothy didn't initially tell many people about them because they started innocuously. A man would call and say, "I love you, Dorothy." Then hang up. Strange, yes. But Dorothy initially thought it might be a wrong number, someone calling for a different Dorothy. Or maybe a prank. Teenagers making crank calls was common in that era. She tried to dismiss it. But the calls kept coming. Same voice. Always specifically asking for Dorothy Scott. Always knowing details about her life. This wasn't a wrong number. The voice was distinctive, male, calm, not particularly deep or high-pitched. And here's what haunted Dorothy, the voice was familiar. She felt like she should know who it was. The cadence, the tone, something about it rang a bell in her memory. But she couldn't place it. She'd go through mental lists of everyone she knew. Coworkers? Customers from work? Someone from church? Neighbors? Former classmates? No one quite matched. Or maybe multiple people could match. The voice was familiar enough to be recognizable but not distinctive enough to pin down. This uncertainty was its own form of torture. Dorothy started second-guessing every interaction. Was it that guy at the grocery store who'd smiled at her? Was it the maintenance man at her apartment complex? Was it someone at church who'd been too friendly? Every man became a potential suspect. By early 1980, the frequency of calls had increased to several times a week. Dorothy would come home from work, and her aunt would say, "That man called again." Or the phone would ring while Dorothy was home, and she'd answer to hear, "I'm thinking about you, Dorothy. I'm always thinking about you." Dorothy changed her phone number in February 1980, hoping that would end it. She only gave the new number to family, close friends, and her employer. She was careful. For about 2 weeks, the calls stopped. Dorothy felt relief. Maybe changing the number had worked. Maybe the caller had been randomly dialing and couldn't find her new number. Then the calls started again. Same voice. New number. Which meant this person had gotten her new number from someone. Or had access to phone records. Or had connections at the phone company. However he'd done it, he'd found her again. This is when Dorothy became truly frightened. This wasn't random. This was targeted, dedicated, obsessive. Someone was putting real effort into tracking her down. The content of the calls began to shift. The professions of love became tinged with resentment and anger. Why don't you call me back, Dorothy? Don't you love me? You know who this is. You're just pretending you don't. We're meant to be together. Why are you fighting it? The delusion was becoming clearer. This caller believed he had a relationship with Dorothy. In his mind, they were connected, involved, meant to be together. Dorothy's lack of response wasn't evidence that no relationship existed, it was her being stubborn or playing hard to get. Psychologists would later suggest this fit the pattern of erotomania, a delusional disorder where someone believes another person is in love with them. Often the object of the delusion is someone of higher social status, a celebrity, a boss, someone the delusional person admires from afar. The delusion can feel completely real to the person experiencing it. If Dorothy's stalker suffered from erotomania, then her actual behavior, her obvious lack of interest, her fear, her attempts to avoid him, wouldn't penetrate his delusion. He'd reinterpret everything to fit his narrative. She wasn't scared, she was being shy. She wasn't rejecting him, she was testing him. The delusion would twist reality to maintain itself. By March 1980, the calls had become explicitly threatening. If you don't start being nice to me, Dorothy, you'll regret it. I know where you live. I know where you work. I know where you go to church. You can't hide from me. I'm going to have you, Dorothy. One way or another, you're going to be mine. Dorothy reported the calls to the Anaheim Police Department. She gave them descriptions of the calls, approximate times, everything she could remember. The police were sympathetic but limited in what they could do. In 1980, tracking phone calls was difficult and expensive. It required cooperation from the phone company and usually a court order. Without a specific, immediate threat, without a crime having been committed, the police couldn't justify the resources to trace the calls. They advised Dorothy to keep a log of the calls, to try to record them if possible, though home recording equipment wasn't common in 1980, and to document everything. If the caller made a specific, actionable threat, they could do more. Dorothy felt let down by the system, but what choice did she have? She started keeping a notebook, writing down the date and time of each call and what was said. She hoped maybe a pattern would emerge that would help identify the caller. The pattern that emerged was terrifying, the calls were escalating. April 1980 brought the most explicit threats yet. I'm watching you, Dorothy. I watched you go into work today. I like that blue dress you were wearing. This was proof the caller wasn't just making phone calls. He was physically surveilling her. He was seeing her, observing her, stalking her in person. Dorothy became hypervigilant. She'd scan parking lots before approaching her car. She'd check her rearview mirror constantly while driving, looking for vehicles that might be following her. She'd vary her routes home from work. The stress was taking a physical toll. Dorothy lost weight. She had trouble sleeping. She'd wake up at night, certain she'd heard something, her heart pounding. She was living in a constant state of fear. And then came the dead rose. It was mid-April, on an ordinary workday. Dorothy came out of work in the early evening to find a single black rose on her windshield, placed deliberately under the wiper blade where she couldn't miss it. The rose was spray-painted black or had been dyed. It was dried, dead, brittle. And it was clearly a message. Dorothy's hands shook as she removed it from her windshield. She looked around the parking lot. Was he watching her now? Was he nearby, enjoying her fear? She took the rose inside and showed her coworkers. They were horrified. This wasn't just phone calls anymore. This person had been to her workplace. Had touched her car. Had been physically close to her. One coworker suggested she show it to the police. Dorothy did. She brought the rose to the Anaheim Police Department along with her call log. The detective she spoke with was concerned but still limited in what he could do. The rose wasn't threatening in itself, it was weird, creepy, but not illegal. Combined with the phone calls, it painted a picture of escalating stalking behavior, but California in 1980 didn't have comprehensive stalking laws. The detective advised Dorothy to consider getting a restraining order, but against whom? She couldn't identify the stalker. You can't get a restraining order against an unknown person. Dorothy left the police station feeling helpless. The system was supposed to protect people, but it couldn't protect her because she couldn't identify her attacker. It was a cruel catch-22. In late April or early May, the caller's threats became graphic and specific. When I get you alone, Dorothy, I'm going to cut you into bits and pieces. I'm going to cut you up so small that no one will ever find you. This level of specificity marked a dangerous escalation. He wasn't just saying, I'm going to hurt you or I'm going to kill you. He was describing a method. He was fantasizing about dismemberment, about making her body disappear. Experts in stalking behavior know that when threats become specific and detailed, the risk of actual violence increases dramatically. The stalker has moved from general anger to active planning. They're visualizing the crime, working through the steps, preparing mentally to act. Dorothy was terrified. She told her father about the most recent threat. Jacob Scott was furious and afraid. He wanted to protect his daughter, but how? He couldn't guard her 24 hours a day. He couldn't identify the caller any more than Dorothy could. Jacob suggested Dorothy come stay with him and Vera. At least then she wouldn't be alone. But Dorothy was worried about putting her parents in danger. What if the caller followed her there? What if he escalated because she'd moved? She didn't want her elderly parents caught in the crossfire of this madman's obsession. This is the impossible situation stalking victims often face. Every decision feels dangerous. Stay where you are, you're a known target. Move, you might provoke escalation. Go to family for protection, you might endanger them. The stalker has already taken your peace of mind, now every choice you make is shadowed by fear. Dorothy decided the best option was to be prepared to defend herself. Hence the karate classes. Hence the consideration of buying a gun. She couldn't identify her stalker, couldn't stop the calls, couldn't get police protection. But she could try to make herself a harder target. In the final week before her disappearance, Dorothy confided in a coworker named Pam Head. She told Pam about the calls, about the rose, about her fear. Pam was sympathetic and worried. She told Dorothy to be careful, to never go anywhere alone if possible. Ironically, Dorothy took this advice seriously. Which is why, on May 28, when Conrad Bostrom needed to go to the hospital, Dorothy didn't want him to go alone. She'd drive him. Pam would come too. Safety in numbers. But safety in numbers only works if you all stay together. The last call Dorothy received that we know about came on May 27, the day before she disappeared. The caller said, "Tomorrow, Dorothy. Tomorrow you're going to be mine." Dorothy told her aunt about this call. Her aunt begged her not to go to work the next day. Stay home. Call in sick. Don't give him the opportunity. But Dorothy had the employee meeting on the 28th. She couldn't just not show up. She needed this job. She had a son to support. She couldn't let fear paralyze her life completely. So she went to work on May 28. She attended the meeting. And when Conrad needed help, she offered it, because that's who Dorothy was. And her stalker was waiting. May 28, 1980, started as an unremarkable day for Dorothy Scott. She woke up, got her son Sean ready, dropped him off with her aunt who would watch him while Dorothy was at work, and drove to Custom John Enterprises in Anaheim. The weather was typical for late May in Southern California, warm, clear, pleasant. Nothing about the day suggested the horror that would unfold that evening. Dorothy's workday was routine. Phone calls, typing, filing, the usual secretarial duties. Her coworkers noticed nothing unusual about her demeanor. She seemed her normal self, quiet, professional, perhaps a bit stressed, but that had been her baseline for months given the stalking situation. The employee meeting was scheduled for after normal business hours, around 8 o'clock or 8:30 p.m. This wasn't uncommon. The small company would hold meetings in the evening so they didn't disrupt the workday. Attendance was mandatory for all staff. About 15 to 20 employees gathered in the meeting space. The agenda was routine, updates on current projects, policy reminders, upcoming deadlines, and other administrative matters. Nothing exciting. Most employees were probably thinking about getting home afterward rather than paying close attention to the meeting content. Dorothy sat with her coworkers, taking notes when necessary, participating when called upon. She was professional as always. Among the employees at the meeting were two people who would become crucial witnesses to Dorothy's disappearance, Conrad Bostron and Pam Head. Conrad was a coworker Dorothy knew casually. He was friendly, reliable, the kind of person who was easy to work with. Pam Head was closer to Dorothy. They'd worked together longer and had developed a friendship. Dorothy had confided in Pam about the stalking calls, and Pam was one of the few people outside Dorothy's family who understood how afraid she was. The meeting proceeded normally until about 9 p.m. when Conrad mentioned he wasn't feeling well. His arm hurt. He showed people, it was swollen, red, and the redness was spreading. Someone with medical knowledge recognized it immediately. This looked like a black widow spider bite. Black widow bites are serious. The venom is neurotoxic. While rarely fatal in healthy adults, they require medical attention. Left untreated, they can cause severe pain, muscle spasms, and other complications. Conrad needed to get to a hospital emergency room. Several people immediately volunteered to drive him. Dorothy was one of the first to offer. She had her car. She didn't live far from the hospital. She could take Conrad and stay with him to make sure he was okay. Pam had volunteered to come along as well. This way Conrad wouldn't be alone, and Dorothy wouldn't have to stay at the hospital by herself late into the night if Conrad's treatment took a long time. The three of them left the meeting around 9:15 p.m. The plan was simple: drive to UCI Medical Center in Orange, get Conrad treated, then everyone would go home. Straightforward. They took Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon. It was distinctive, white, boxy, the kind of car that was common in the 1970s but recognizable. Dorothy had owned it for a few years. It was reliable transportation, nothing fancy, but it served her needs. Conrad sat in the front passenger seat. Pam sat in the back. Dorothy drove. The hospital was about 15 to 20 minutes away, depending on traffic. During the drive, they talked about Conrad's symptoms, about whether he'd seen the spider that bit him. He hadn't, about how painful it was, very. Dorothy was calm, focused on getting Conrad help. She drove carefully, following speed limits, making sure they got there safely. They arrived at UCI Medical Center around 9:40 p.m. The emergency room entrance was well lit, busy with typical evening ER traffic. Dorothy parked in the parking lot adjacent to the ER. Conrad was admitted fairly quickly given the nature of his injury. Black widow bites are taken seriously by medical staff. He was brought back to an examination room. Dorothy and Pam stayed in the waiting area. While they waited, Dorothy mentioned to Pam that she wanted to quickly stop by her parents' house. It was nearby, maybe 10 minutes away. She wanted to check on them and maybe change clothes. She was wearing a black scarf around her neck, and she wanted to swap it for a red one she'd left at her parents' house. This detail, the scarf change, would later become significant because Dorothy's killer would reference it, proving he'd been watching her that evening. Dorothy asked Pam if she wanted to come along or if she'd rather wait at the hospital. Pam decided to stay. Conrad might be brought back out soon, and someone should be there. Dorothy left the hospital around 10 p.m. She drove the short distance to her parents' home in Anaheim, arriving around 10:10 p.m. Jacob and Vera Scott were surprised but happy to see their daughter. They'd been watching television, winding down for the evening. Dorothy explained about Conrad's spider bite, about waiting at the hospital, about wanting to check on them. She went into her old bedroom where she kept some personal items. She removed the black scarf she'd been wearing and replaced it with a red one. She chatted with her parents for a few minutes, assured them she was fine, said she needed to get back to the hospital. The visit lasted no more than 15 minutes. Dorothy hugged her parents, told them she loved them, and left. This was the last time Jacob and Vera Scott would see their daughter alive. It was approximately 10:25 p.m. when Dorothy left her parents' home and began driving back to UCI Medical Center. The drive should have taken 10 to 12 minutes. At the hospital, Pam had continued waiting. Conrad was still being examined and treated. The ER was moderately busy, not packed, but steady. Pam sat in the waiting area, reading magazines, checking the time periodically. Around 10:40 p.m., Conrad was released. The doctors had administered medication, provided instructions for follow-up care, and determined he was stable to go home. Conrad came out to the waiting area where Pam was sitting. "Where's Dorothy?" Conrad asked. "She went to her parents' house to change her scarf," Pam explained. "She should be back any minute." They waited. 10:45 p.m. 10:50 p.m. 10:55 p.m. Conrad and Pam stood near the emergency room entrance, outside in the warm California night, waiting for Dorothy to pull up and pick them up. The parking lot where Dorothy had parked earlier was about 100 yards from the entrance, around a curved driveway. At approximately 11 p.m., they saw headlights approaching from the direction of the parking lot. Dorothy's white Toyota station wagon was coming toward them, following the curved drive that led to the ER entrance. The headlights were on high beam, bright and somewhat blinding in the darkness. Conrad and Pam moved toward the curb, preparing to get in the car. They could see the distinctive shape of Dorothy's station wagon clearly. It was her car, no question. But as the car got closer, instead of slowing down and pulling to the curb to pick them up, it suddenly accelerated. The engine revved. The car picked up speed. And it drove right past them without stopping. The headlights on high beam momentarily blinded both Conrad and Pam. They threw their hands up to shield their eyes from the glare. By the time their vision adjusted, the Toyota was already past them, speeding out of the hospital area and onto the main road. Conrad and Pam stood there in stunned confusion. "What just happened?" Pam said. "Why did she just leave?" They looked at each other, bewildered. This made no sense. Dorothy was the one who had volunteered to drive Conrad to the hospital. She'd stayed with them, waited with them, gone out of her way to help. Why would she suddenly drive away without picking them up? Maybe she forgot something? Conrad suggested, though even as he said it, he knew it didn't make sense. Maybe she's coming back around? Pam offered. They waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The white Toyota didn't return. They went back into the hospital and used a payphone to call Dorothy's parents' house. Maybe she'd had some kind of emergency with Sean. Maybe she'd gotten a call and had to leave. Vera Scott answered. No, Dorothy had left their house around 10:25 p.m. to drive back to the hospital. She should have been there by 10:40 at the latest. Was everything okay? Pam explained what had happened, that Dorothy's car had come to pick them up but then driven away without stopping. Vera was immediately concerned. That wasn't like Dorothy at all. They tried calling Dorothy's aunt's house where Sean was staying. The aunt answered. No, she hadn't heard from Dorothy. Sean was asleep. What was going on? By 11:30 p.m., genuine worry was setting in. Conrad and Pam called a coworker who lived nearby to come pick them up from the hospital. They didn't know what else to do. By midnight, Dorothy's family was in full panic mode. Jacob Scott drove to the hospital, searching the parking lot for Dorothy's car. It wasn't there. He drove the route between the hospital and his house, thinking maybe Dorothy had broken down or had an accident. Nothing. He returned home and called the Anaheim Police Department to report his daughter missing. The police response was frustratingly typical for missing adult cases. She'd been gone less than 2 hours. Maybe she'd gone somewhere. Maybe she'd meet up with someone. Adults have the right to come and go as they please. Give it 24 hours. Jacob tried to explain that Dorothy wouldn't just disappear. She had a 4-year-old son. She'd been receiving threatening phone calls from a stalker for months. She'd driven away from the hospital in a way that made no sense. Something was wrong. The police took the report but didn't initiate an immediate search. There was no evidence of foul play yet. A woman's car had driven away from a hospital. Without more information, there wasn't much they could do. The Scott family didn't sleep that night. They called everyone they could think of. Dorothy's friends, her coworkers, people from church, anyone who might have heard from her or seen her. No one had. As the night turned into early morning, and Dorothy still hadn't come home, hadn't called, hadn't made contact in any way, the family's terror grew. At approximately 5 a.m. on May 29, 1980, the Anaheim Police Department received a call about a vehicle fire. A white Toyota station wagon was burning in an alley off Beach Boulevard in Santa Ana, about 10 miles from UCI Medical Center. The fire department had already been dispatched. When police ran the license plate, it came back registered to Dorothy Jane Scott of Stanton, California. The same Dorothy Jane Scott who had been reported missing just hours earlier. Firefighters extinguished the flames, but the interior of the vehicle was destroyed. The seats were burned down to the springs. The dashboard was melted. The steering wheel was partially melted. Whatever had been inside the car was now ash and twisted metal. Arson investigators determined the fire had been set deliberately. There was evidence of an accelerant, likely gasoline, poured inside the vehicle before it was ignited. Someone had wanted this car to burn, wanted evidence destroyed. Police began processing the scene, but there was little left to find. The intense heat of the fire had eliminated any potential evidence, fingerprints, hair, fibers, all gone. The vehicle identification number confirmed it was Dorothy's car, but Dorothy herself was nowhere to be found. Around 6 a.m., police arrived at Jacob and Vera Scott's home to inform them that Dorothy's car had been found burned. The family's worst fears were being confirmed. This wasn't Dorothy going somewhere voluntarily. This was foul play. But where was Dorothy? If she'd been in the car when it burned, there would be remains. The fire was intense, but bodies don't completely disappear in vehicle fires. Yet police had found no human remains in or around the burned Toyota. This meant one of two possibilities: either Dorothy had been taken somewhere else before the car was burned, or she'd been in the car and her body had been removed before it was set on fire. Either scenario was nightmarish. Detectives from the Anaheim Police Department took over the investigation. They interviewed Conrad Bostron and Pam Head extensively about the events at the hospital. Both witnesses were consistent in their accounts. Dorothy had driven them to the hospital around 9:40 p.m. Dorothy had left to visit her parents around 10 p.m. Dorothy's parents confirmed she'd been at their home from approximately 10:10 to 10:25 p.m. Dorothy should have returned to the hospital by 10:40 p.m. at the latest. At approximately 11 p.m., Dorothy's car arrived at the hospital entrance. The car had accelerated past Conrad and Pam without stopping. The headlights had been on high beam, blinding both witnesses. Neither witness got a clear look at who was driving. This last detail was crucial. Neither Conrad nor Pam could definitively say whether Dorothy had been driving her own car or whether someone else had been behind the wheel. The headlights on high beam seemed deliberate. It prevented Conrad and Pam from seeing clearly who was driving. Was that intentional? Did someone want to make sure they couldn't identify the driver? And if someone else was driving Dorothy's car at 11 p.m., where was Dorothy? Was she in the car, hidden or restrained? Had she already been killed by that point? Or was she still alive somewhere, being held by her abductor? The timeline was tight. Dorothy had left her parents' house at 10:25 p.m. Her car appeared at the hospital at 11 p.m., a 35-minute gap. The drive from her parents' house to the hospital should have taken 10 to 12 minutes maximum. Where had Dorothy and her car been during those missing 20 to 25 minutes? Police theorized several scenarios. Scenario A, Dorothy had been intercepted between her parents' house and the hospital. Someone had forced her off the road or blocked her path. They'd taken control of her and her vehicle, driven to the hospital to create confusion about the timeline, then driven away to a secondary location where they'd killed her and burned the car. Scenario B, Dorothy had been grabbed when she returned to the hospital parking lot to get her car around 10:40 p.m. She'd walked to her car alone in the dark parking lot. Someone had been waiting for her there. They'd subdued her, put her in the car, driven past Conrad and Pam to make it look like Dorothy was leaving voluntarily, then driven away to kill her. Scenario C, Dorothy had never made it back to the hospital at all. Someone had intercepted her somewhere between her parents' house and the hospital. They'd driven her car to the hospital to establish a false timeline and confuse investigators, then driven away to a secondary location. Each scenario had problems. Each left questions unanswered. But all three scenarios pointed to the same conclusion: someone had taken Dorothy, had taken her car, and had deliberately created confusion about when and where she'd been abducted. The burning of the car was clearly meant to destroy evidence. The fire had been thorough, professional almost. Whoever did this knew that fire destroys DNA, fingerprints, hair, fibers, all the microscopic evidence that could link them to the crime. But they'd made one mistake: they'd left the car in a location where it would be found. If you're trying to make someone disappear completely, you don't burn their car in a city alley where firefighters will be called and police will respond. You drive it to a remote area, burn it there, and hope it's not discovered for days or weeks. The fact that the car was found so quickly suggested either panic or a desire for it to be found. Perhaps the killer wanted police to know something had happened to Dorothy. Perhaps he was already planning to gloat about what he'd done. Within 24 hours of Dorothy's disappearance, her stalking situation became the focus of the investigation. Family members told detectives about the months of threatening phone calls. About the dead rose on her windshield. About Dorothy's fear that someone was watching her. The stalker had told Dorothy, "When I get you alone, I'm going to cut you into bits and pieces so small that no one will ever find you." Now Dorothy was gone. Her car had been found burned. And her body was nowhere to be found. The stalker had apparently made good on his threat. But who was he? That was the question that would haunt investigators for years to come. 1 week after Dorothy Scott vanished, the Scott family was living in a state of suspended horror. They knew something terrible had happened to Dorothy. Her burned car, her sudden disappearance, the stalking calls she'd been receiving, all of it pointed to abduction and likely murder. But without a body, without concrete proof of death, they existed in a terrible limbo. Was Dorothy dead? Was she being held somewhere? Was she suffering? These questions tormented them day and night. On June 4, 1980, 7 days after Dorothy disappeared, the phone rang at Jacob and Vera Scott's home. Vera answered. "Hello? Is this the Scott residence?" a man's voice asked. "Yes," Vera replied, her heart immediately racing. Something about the voice, the tone, felt wrong. "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" the man asked. "Yes, I'm her mother," Vera said. "Do you know where she is? Do you have information?" There was a pause. Then the man said 4 words that would haunt Vera for the rest of her life. "I have her." Before Vera could respond, before she could ask any questions, the line went dead. The caller had hung up. Vera stood there holding the phone, shaking. Those words. "I have her." Not, "I've seen her," or "I heard about her," or "I might have information." He said, "I have her." Present tense. Possessive. As if Dorothy was an object he owned. Vera immediately called the police. She described the call, the exact words used, the tone of voice. Detectives arrived at the house to interview her about the call. Did Vera recognize the voice? She wasn't sure. It was male, calm, deliberate. But she didn't know if it was the same voice that had been calling Dorothy with threats. Dorothy had never played the threatening calls for her family, had never described the voice in enough detail for Vera to compare. Could the call be traced? In 1980, call tracing required advanced setup and cooperation from the phone company. You couldn't retroactively trace a call that had already ended. The technology didn't exist yet. The police could set up a trace for future calls, but that required equipment and time. And it wasn't foolproof. If a caller stayed on the line for less than a certain amount of time, the trace wouldn't complete. The police did arrange for a trace system to be installed on the Scott's home phone. If the caller called again and stayed on the line long enough, they might be able to trace the call to a specific location. But the next Wednesday, when the call came again, it followed the same pattern. The phone rang. Vera answered. The same male voice said, "I killed Dorothy Scott. She's dead." Then he hung up. Not enough time for a trace to complete. The week after that, another call. "Is Dorothy home?" the voice asked mockingly. Click. This became a nightmare routine. Every week, usually on Wednesday, sometimes on other days, the phone would ring. The same voice would say something about Dorothy. Sometimes claiming he'd killed her. Sometimes asking if she was home. Sometimes just saying, "I have her," and hanging up. The psychological torture this inflicted on the Scott family is difficult to overstate. They were grieving, desperate for answers, and every week they'd be jolted back into acute trauma by these calls. The caller seemed to enjoy their anguish. He'd time the calls for maximum impact, sometimes late at night when they'd finally fallen asleep, sometimes during dinner, sometimes early in the morning. Unpredictable enough to keep them constantly on edge. Jacob Scott took to answering the phone himself whenever possible. He wanted to shield Vera from hearing that voice. But the calls continued regardless of who answered. "Tell me where she is," Jacob would demand. The caller would just laugh or hang up. "Why are you doing this?" Vera would beg during the rare calls where the man stayed on the line for more than a few seconds. Silence. Then click. The calls weren't just torture for the family. They were evidence of a deeply disturbed mind. This wasn't someone who'd killed in a moment of passion and was now trying to distance himself from the crime. This was someone who wanted to stay connected to the crime, who wanted to relive it, who wanted his victims, not just Dorothy, but her entire family, to suffer continuously. Criminal psychologists who later reviewed the case suggested the caller might be experiencing a form of sadistic gratification. He'd taken Dorothy's life, but that wasn't enough. He needed to keep hurting people connected to her. He needed to maintain his power over them. The calls also served another purpose: they kept the killer connected to the investigation. He could monitor whether police were getting close. He could gauge the family's response. He could adjust his behavior if he felt threatened. On June 12, 1980, exactly 2 weeks after Dorothy's disappearance, the Orange County Register newspaper published a story about the case. The headline read, "Anaheim Woman Still Missing After Mysterious Disappearance." The article detailed Dorothy's vanishing from the hospital, the discovery of her burned car, and the fact that she'd been receiving threatening calls from a stalker prior to her disappearance. The article was published in the morning edition. By noon that same day, the killer called the Orange County Register directly. He asked to speak to a reporter. When a reporter got on the line, the caller said, "I'm calling about the Dorothy Scott case. I'm the one who killed her." The reporter, trained to handle strange calls, tried to keep the man talking. "Can you tell me what happened?" The caller was surprisingly willing to talk. Over the next several minutes, he provided details that shocked investigators when the reporter later shared the recording with police. "Dorothy was my love," the caller said. "I loved her. I would have done anything for her. But she betrayed me. She was seeing another man. She was cheating on me." The reporter pointed out that according to all accounts, Dorothy wasn't dating anyone. She was a single mother focused on her son and her work. "That's what everyone thinks," the caller responded. "But I knew the truth. I saw her with him. She was lying to everyone. She was mine, and she was seeing someone else behind my back. This was pure delusion. Dorothy hadn't been in a relationship with anyone, let alone cheating on anyone. But in the caller's mind, he and Dorothy had been together. She'd belonged to him. And she'd betrayed him. What happened on May 28th? The reporter asked. I waited for her, the caller said. She called me from the hospital. She told me to meet her there. This was a lie. Dorothy had been with Conrad and Pam at the hospital. She'd never been alone. She'd never had an opportunity to call anyone. The caller was constructing a narrative that justified his actions. She wanted to see me, he continued. But when I got there, she tried to leave with him. With the other man. So I stopped her. I had to stop her. She belonged to me. What did you do to her? The reporter asked. I took her with me, the caller said. She needed to understand that she couldn't treat me that way. She needed to know I was serious. Where is Dorothy now? The reporter pressed. She's gone, the caller said. She's not coming back. Did you kill her? She gave me no choice, the caller said. If I couldn't have her, no one could. Where is her body? The caller paused. Then he said, You'll never find her. I made sure of that. Just like I promised her. I cut her into pieces so small that no one will ever find her. Then he hung up. The reporter immediately contacted the Anaheim Police Department and provided them with a recording of the call. Detectives listened to it multiple times, analyzing every word, every inflection, every detail. The caller had revealed crucial information that validated his claim to be Dorothy's killer. 1. He knew about the hospital. He knew Dorothy had been at UCI Medical Center on the night she disappeared. 2. He knew about the changed scarf. The caller had mentioned to the newspaper that Dorothy had been wearing a red scarf when he met her. This was significant because Dorothy had changed from a black scarf to a red scarf at her parents' house that evening, a detail that had not been made public. Only Dorothy's parents, Conrad, and Pam knew about this detail. 3. He knew about Conrad. The caller had referenced the other man, his delusional belief that Dorothy was with another man. This likely referred to Conrad Bostron, who'd been with Dorothy that evening. The caller had been watching the hospital, had seen Dorothy with Conrad, and in his delusional state had interpreted their professional/friendly relationship as romantic. For he repeated the specific threat, cut into pieces so small that no one will find her, had been the exact threat Dorothy reported receiving in the weeks before her death. Only Dorothy, her immediate family, and the police knew the specific wording of that threat. These details confirmed beyond any doubt that the person making these calls was Dorothy's killer. But the call also revealed something else. The killer was deeply delusional. He genuinely believed he'd had a relationship with Dorothy. He believed she'd betrayed him. He'd constructed an entire narrative in which he was the victim and Dorothy had forced him to kill her through her betrayal. This type of delusional thinking, believing you have a relationship with someone who doesn't know you or doesn't reciprocate your feelings, is characteristic of erotomania or de Clerambault syndrome. The delusion can be so strong that the person experiencing it genuinely cannot distinguish their fantasy from reality. In the killer's mind, he and Dorothy had been together. Her lack of romantic interest wasn't evidence that no relationship existed, it was her being shy, playing hard to get, or eventually betraying him. Every interaction, no matter how mundane or professional, was reinterpreted to fit his delusion. When Dorothy went to the hospital with Conrad, the killer saw it as her going on a date with another man. When she tried to leave the hospital in her car, he saw it as her trying to escape with her lover. Her actual reality, helping a coworker with a medical emergency, didn't exist in his delusional framework. This made the killer even more dangerous than a calculated predator. A calculated killer acts with logic, even if that logic is evil. But a delusional killer acts according to a completely distorted reality. You can't predict their behavior because their motivations don't follow rational patterns. The calls to the Scott family continued week after week. Police had the phone company working on tracing technology, but the caller was careful. He never stayed on the line long enough for a trace to complete. He seemed to understand the limitations of 1980s phone tracing technology. Sometimes the calls would come from payphones, police would trace them to specific locations, but by the time officers arrived, the caller was long gone. He'd make a call, hang up, and leave the area immediately. Other times the calls seemed to come from different locations around Orange County. The killer was mobile, never calling from the same place twice in a row, making it impossible to stake out a location and wait for him. The content of the calls varied. "She's with me. She'll always be with me now. Did you miss Dorothy this week?" "I didn't. I see her every day. She's not in pain anymore. I made sure of that. You'll never find her. I'm too smart for you. She's mine forever now." Just like it was supposed to be. Each call was a fresh wound for the family. Each time they'd try to gather information, try to keep the caller talking, try to understand what had happened to Dorothy. But the caller controlled every conversation, hanging up whenever he chose, leaving them with more questions than answers. By late 1980, 6 months after Dorothy's disappearance, the calls were still coming regularly. The Scotts had largely stopped answering their phone except for calls from people they recognized. They'd let the answering machine pick up, a relatively new technology in 1980, screening calls before deciding whether to answer. But even hearing the killer's voice on the answering machine was traumatic. "Hello, Scott family. Just calling to remind you that I still have Dorothy. Have a nice day." Click. The Anaheim Police Department assigned detectives specifically to the case. They reviewed every lead, interviewed dozens of people connected to Dorothy, investigated the customers and coworkers from the head shop where she'd worked. But with no physical evidence, no body, and an unknown caller, the investigation struggled to gain traction. They had his voice on tape. They had his general psychological profile. But they didn't have his identity. In early 1981, something changed. The calls started to come less frequently. Instead of weekly, they came monthly. Then every few months. The killer seemed to be losing interest or running out of things to say. But he didn't stop completely. For 4 years, from 1980 to 1984, the calls continued sporadically. Sometimes months would go by without a call. The family would start to hope maybe it was finally over. Then the phone would ring again. "Is Dorothy home? I miss her. Do you miss her? I think about her every day." By 1984, the calls had slowed to a trickle. The killer's obsession seemed to be waning, or perhaps he'd found other outlets for his compulsions. Then something interesting happened. Jacob Scott started answering the phone more consistently himself. He'd realized something. When he answered, the caller would usually hang up immediately without saying anything. But when Vera answered, the caller would deliver his message before hanging up. This suggested the killer knew both of their voices. He wasn't comfortable speaking to Jacob, only to Vera. Why? The most likely explanation: the killer knew Jacob Scott personally. If he spoke to Jacob, Jacob might recognize his voice. But Vera, who had less contact with Dorothy's work and social circle, wouldn't necessarily recognize him. This was a crucial investigative lead. It meant the killer was likely someone from Dorothy's work environment, someone Jacob had met or spoken to before. Someone who knew the family well enough to distinguish their voices over the phone. Armed with this theory, police focused their investigation on men from Dorothy's workplace and her regular customers at the head shop. Who would Jacob Scott have met or spoken to? Who would be familiar enough with the family to recognize Jacob's voice? The suspect list narrowed, but still no breakthrough came. And then, in mid-1984, the calls stopped completely. The killer had made his last call. The phone would ring at the Scott house, but it would no longer be him. The weekly terror, the monthly reminders, the psychological torture, it all went silent. Why did he stop? Several theories emerged. Theory 1, he died. The abrupt cessation of calls after 4 years of consistency suggested something might have happened to the caller. Perhaps he died in an accident, or from natural causes, or even by suicide. Theory 2, he was incarcerated. Perhaps the killer had been arrested for another crime and was now in prison, unable to make phone calls to the Scott family. Theory 3, he moved away. Maybe the killer left California, moved to another state or country, and decided to leave this part of his life behind. Theory 4. His delusion broke. Perhaps after 4 years, the caller's delusional connection to Dorothy had finally weakened. The fantasy could no longer sustain itself. He moved on psychologically. Theory 5. He recognized the danger. After 4 years of calling, perhaps the killer realized he was pushing his luck. Phone tracing technology was improving. Police were getting closer. He decided the risk of being caught was no longer worth the satisfaction of tormenting the family. The truth is, no one knows why the calls stopped. And in some ways, the silence was almost worse than the calls had been. At least the calls meant the killer was still out there to be caught. The silence meant he might be gone forever, taking his secrets with him. From the moment Dorothy disappeared, the Anaheim Police Department knew they were dealing with a stalking case that had escalated to murder. The months of threatening phone calls, the dead rose, Dorothy's own fears, everything pointed to an obsessed individual who'd been planning this for some time. The investigation focused on answering one critical question: who was the man who'd been calling Dorothy? Dorothy had told family and friends that she recognized something about the voice but couldn't place it. This suggested someone she knew casually, perhaps a customer from work, someone she'd spoken to briefly but not extensively. Not a close friend or family member, but also not a complete stranger. The police started with Dorothy's workplace, Custom John Enterprises, also known as Swinger's Psych Shop. The business was a head shop, catering to counterculture clientele in Orange County. They sold custom products, smoking accessories, posters, and various items associated with 1970s California culture. The customer base was eclectic, to say the least. Hippies, bikers, college students, musicians, artists, and various countercultural figures frequented the shop. It wasn't unusual for the business to attract customers with criminal backgrounds, substance abuse issues, or unconventional lifestyles. Dorothy had worked there as a secretary for several years. She'd interacted with countless customers, taken phone orders, processed paperwork. She was professional and friendly, but she kept her distance from the more colorful clientele. Detectives began the painstaking process of identifying and interviewing everyone who'd had regular contact with Dorothy through the business. They compiled lists of employees, regular customers, vendors, delivery drivers, anyone who might have developed an obsession with her. One name kept coming up in conversations: Mike Butler. Mike Butler had previously owned a store where Dorothy had worked before joining Custom John Enterprises. Multiple people mentioned that Butler had seemed particularly interested in Dorothy, perhaps too interested. Detectives learned the following about Mike Butler. Background: male, approximately 40 to 45 years old in 1980. Had owned a small business in the Orange County area. Lived alone in a remote area in the Santiago Mountains east of Orange. Described by acquaintances as a loner, eccentric, possibly unstable. Had a sister who had worked with Dorothy, which is how Butler would have known her. Connection to Dorothy. Had employed Dorothy briefly at his previous business. Would occasionally visit the shop where Dorothy worked. According to coworkers, Butler seemed to pay special attention to Dorothy when he visited. Would sometimes call the business and ask to speak to Dorothy specifically, though Dorothy had said she didn't know him well. Suspicious elements. After Dorothy's disappearance, Butler seemed nervous when questioned by police. His answers to basic questions about his whereabouts on May 28 were vague and inconsistent. He lived alone in an isolated area, exactly the kind of place where someone could hold or dispose of a victim without witnesses. His sister, who'd worked with Dorothy, would have given him access to information about Dorothy's schedule and habits. The Santiago Mountains location. Butler's property in the Santiago Mountains was particularly interesting to investigators. The area was remote, mountainous, covered in dense brush and wildlife. There were countless places where a body could be hidden and never found. Detectives obtained a search warrant for Butler's property and conducted an extensive search in late 1980. They brought in cadaver dogs, search teams, and forensic specialists. The property was sprawling and unkempt. Butler lived in a small, run-down house filled with clutter. The land around it was undeveloped, just natural terrain with no landscaping or improvements. Cadavered dogs alerted in several areas on the property, suggesting possible decomposition. These areas were excavated carefully. Searchers dug several feet down in multiple locations. They found nothing. No human remains. No evidence of Dorothy. The dog alerts might have been from animal remains or false positives. The search of Butler's house revealed he was a hoarder of sorts. Piles of newspapers, magazines, random objects filled every room. Detectives sorted through it all looking for anything connected to Dorothy, photos, belongings, trophies from the crime. Again, nothing. No red scarf. No items belonging to Dorothy. No evidence linking Butler to her disappearance. The interview. Detectives interviewed Mike Butler extensively. The interviews were conducted at the police station, on the record, with Butler agreeing to speak without a lawyer present. Butler denied any involvement in Dorothy's disappearance. He admitted he'd known her from the time she worked at his store, but he insisted they'd had only a professional relationship. He claimed he'd been at home alone on the night of May 28, no alibi, but also no evidence contradicting his claim. When asked if he'd ever called Dorothy at home, Butler became defensive. "Why would I call her?" he asked. "I barely knew her." But when pressed about whether he'd found Dorothy attractive, Butler's demeanor changed. He became evasive, uncomfortable. "I mean, she was a nice-looking woman," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean anything." Detectives asked if Butler would be willing to provide a voice sample for comparison with the recordings of the killer's phone calls. Butler hesitated, then agreed. The voice sample was analyzed by audio specialists. The conclusion: Butler's voice had some similarities to the voice on the recordings, but the analysis was inconclusive. In 1980, voice analysis technology was limited. The recordings of the killer were of poor quality, made over phone lines that distorted sound. A definitive match couldn't be made. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without a confession, there was nothing to charge Butler with. He remained a person of interest, but he was free to go. The rumor mill. In the years following Dorothy's disappearance, rumors swirled around Mike Butler. People who'd known him described increasingly bizarre behavior. Butler allegedly became interested in occult practices and may have been involved with fringe religious groups. He was said to have become more isolated, cutting off contact with most people he'd known. There were unsubstantiated rumors that he'd been involved in other crimes, though nothing was ever proven. Some people in the community were convinced Butler was the killer. He fit the profile: obsessed loner with access to Dorothy, living in an isolated location where evidence could be hidden, nervous and evasive when questioned. But conviction in a court of law requires proof, not just suspicion. And there was no proof. Mike Butler died in the late 1990s, taking whatever secrets he might have had to his grave. If he was Dorothy's killer, justice would never be served. If he wasn't, then his life had been shadowed by suspicion he didn't deserve. Other suspects. While Butler was the primary focus, police investigated numerous other potential suspects. Suspect number 2, the customer who visited too often. One regular customer at Swinger's Psych Shop had been noted by Dorothy's coworkers as someone who came in frequently and always seemed to time his visits for when Dorothy was working. This man, whose name was never publicly released, was in his mid-30s, unemployed or self-employed with an irregular schedule, and lived in Anaheim not far from Dorothy's apartment. Coworkers reported that this customer would browse the store for extended periods, not buying much, seemingly just wanting to be in the same space as Dorothy. When Dorothy would help customers, he'd position himself nearby to overhear conversations. Dorothy had mentioned to Pam Head that this customer made her uncomfortable, but she didn't feel he was dangerous, just odd and a little too friendly. Detectives interviewed this man multiple times. He admitted he'd found Dorothy attractive and had enjoyed talking to her when he visited the store. But he denied ever calling her, threatening her, or having anything to do with her disappearance. His alibi for May 28 was weak. He said he'd been home alone watching television. No one could verify his whereabouts. Police placed him under surveillance for several weeks, hoping he might lead them to evidence. He didn't. His life was routine, boring even. If he was Dorothy's killer, he gave no indication of it. Eventually, surveillance was discontinued due to budget constraints. The suspect remained on the list but couldn't be moved forward without new evidence. Suspect number 3, the anonymous tip. In August 1980, police received an anonymous phone call from a woman who claimed her ex-boyfriend had been obsessed with a woman from a shop who matched Dorothy's description. The caller said her ex-boyfriend had talked about this woman constantly, had driven by her workplace repeatedly, and had mentioned knowing where she lived. After Dorothy's disappearance made news, the caller said she'd become suspicious but was afraid to come forward because her ex-boyfriend had been violent toward her during their relationship. Detectives tried to trace the call and identify the caller, but she never called back and had withheld her name. They couldn't follow up without more information. This lead went nowhere, but it illustrated the challenge investigators faced. There might have been witnesses or people with information who were too afraid to come forward. Suspect number 4, the coworker's brother. One of Dorothy's coworkers had a brother who'd visited the shop occasionally and had met Dorothy. According to the coworker, her brother had mentioned thinking Dorothy was attractive. After Dorothy disappeared, the coworker became suspicious because her brother seemed unusually interested in news coverage of the case and would ask her detailed questions about the investigation. Police interviewed the brother. He was a truck driver who was frequently out of state for work. He had alibis for May 28. He'd been making a delivery in Nevada and had truck stop receipts and log books to prove it. He admitted he'd thought Dorothy was pretty but denied any obsession or inappropriate behavior. His interest in the case, he explained, was because his sister had known the victim. It was natural to follow the news. Without evidence to the contrary, police had to accept his explanation. The construction worker theory. Another avenue of investigation focused on construction workers and contractors who'd been working in the area around Dorothy's apartment complex or her workplace. In 1980, there was construction and renovation work being done at various properties in Stanton and Anaheim. Construction workers would have been in the area regularly, might have seen Dorothy coming and going, and would have had the opportunity to observe her routine. Police interviewed dozens of construction workers, but the transient nature of construction work made investigation difficult. Many workers were temporary, paid in cash, and had moved on to other job sites by the time police wanted to interview them. No strong suspect emerged from this line of investigation. The phone records investigation. Detectives obtained Dorothy's phone records for the months preceding her disappearance, hoping to identify the source of the harassing calls. What they found was frustrating. The calls came from different numbers, mostly payphones scattered across Orange County. The caller had been careful not to call from any location consistently. A few calls had come from numbers that were traced to private residences or businesses, but when investigated, these turned out to be payphones located at those addresses, bars, restaurants, stores that had public phones. The killer had been meticulous about not calling from any location that could be traced back to him personally. The media appeals. In 1981 and 1982, the Scott family worked with local media to keep Dorothy's case in the public eye. They appeared on local news programs, gave interviews to newspapers, and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. These appeals generated numerous tips. Each tip was investigated. Most led nowhere. Psychics claiming to know where Dorothy's body was located. People reporting sightings of women who looked like Dorothy, all were cases of mistaken identity. Individuals claiming their neighbor or coworker seemed suspicious, none panned out. Anonymous calls with vague or useless information. A few tips seemed more credible and were followed up extensively, but none provided the breakthrough investigators needed. The forensic limitations. One of the greatest frustrations for investigators was the forensic limitations of the era. In 1980, DNA analysis didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be used in criminal cases until the mid-1980s. Voice analysis was rudimentary and often inconclusive. Call tracing required the caller to stay on the line for minutes, giving plenty of time to complete the trace. Security camera footage was rare and of poor quality when it existed. Computer databases for tracking criminals across jurisdictions were limited. If Dorothy's case had occurred 20 years later, the investigation would have had access to tools that might have made all the difference. But in 1980, investigators were working with mid-20th century technology against a killer who understood its limitations. The frustration mounts. By 1983, 3 years after Dorothy's disappearance, the investigation had essentially stalled. Every lead had been followed. Every suspect had been investigated. Thousands of hours of police work had been invested. But without Dorothy's body, without physical evidence linking a suspect to the crime, without a confession, the case couldn't move forward. The detectives assigned to the case were frustrated but not ready to give up. They knew Dorothy's killer was out there. They knew he'd called to Gloat about what he'd done. They knew he was someone Dorothy had known, someone her father had likely met. But knowing and proving are different things. The case remained open but inactive. Detectives would periodically review the file, hoping to see something that had been missed. But the years passed without progress. And then, in August 1984, 4 years after Dorothy vanished, came the discovery that would finally confirm what everyone had feared. August 6, 1984. More than 4 years had passed since Dorothy Scott vanished from the UCI Medical Center parking lot. Her family had spent those years in agonizing limbo, certain she was dead based on the killer's phone calls, but unable to properly grieve without a body to bury. Jacob Scott had aged visibly during those 4 years. The stress, the grief, the weekly phone calls from his daughter's killer, it had taken a physical toll. Vera had developed health problems exacerbated by stress. Sean, now 8 years old, barely remembered his mother but carried the weight of her absence every day. The killer's phone calls had stopped earlier that year. The silence was unsettling in its own way. For 4 years, those calls had been a terrible connection to what had happened. Now there was just silence. On that August morning, construction workers were clearing land for a new development in Santa Ana, not far from where Dorothy's burned car had been found in 1980. The area was undeveloped, dry brush, scattered trees, typical Southern California scrubland that developers were constantly converting into housing tracts and commercial properties. One of the workers noticed something unusual partially buried in the ground. At first glance, it looked like animal bones, not uncommon in undeveloped areas. But something about them seemed different. Too large. Too distinctive. The worker called his supervisor over. They examined the remains more closely. These weren't animal bones. They were human remains. The construction was immediately halted. The Santa Ana Police Department was called. Within an hour, the site was cordoned off and forensic teams were on scene. The remains were partially buried, scattered across a small area. The bones had been in the ground for years, exposed to weather, insects, and scavengers. Much of the skeleton was recovered, though some smaller bones were missing or damaged. What remained of clothing or personal effects was minimal after 4 years in the ground. But there were 2 items that had survived, a turquoise ring and a wristwatch. The watch had stopped at 12:30 a.m. The date function showed May 29, 1980, just 90 minutes after Dorothy Scott had disappeared from the hospital. That watch told a story. Dorothy had been killed within an hour and a half of being abducted. Whatever had happened to her in those final moments, it had been quick. The killer hadn't kept her alive for days. He'd killed her almost immediately and disposed of her body. The turquoise ring was compared against photos of Dorothy. Her family confirmed, Dorothy had owned and regularly worn a turquoise ring matching that description. But to be certain, the remains needed to be identified through dental records. Dorothy's dental records were obtained from her dentist and compared against the teeth recovered with the skeletal remains. On August 9, 1984, the identification was confirmed. The remains were Dorothy Jane Scott. After 4 years, Dorothy had been found. The location where Dorothy's body was discovered was approximately 3 miles from where her burned car had been found in 1980. The area was relatively isolated in 1980, though by 1984 it was being developed. If not for the construction project, Dorothy's remains might never have been found. The condition of the remains made determining cause of death difficult. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet holes, no cut marks, no fractures that would indicate blunt force trauma. This meant Dorothy had likely died from strangulation, which wouldn't leave marks on bones. Suffocation, same. Wound to soft tissue that didn't damage bone. Poisoning, though toxicology was impossible after 4 years. The medical examiner's official conclusion: cause of death undetermined due to advanced decomposition. Manner of death: homicide. This was frustrating but expected. For years the elements had destroyed any soft tissue evidence that might have revealed how Dorothy died. The killer had chosen the location well, exposed to weather and scavengers. The body had decomposed rapidly. But the killer had made one crucial mistake: he hadn't buried the body deeply enough. Dorothy's remains were only partially buried, shallow enough that erosion and scavenger activity had exposed them over time. If he'd buried her deeper or chosen a more remote location, she might never have been found. Notifying the family. Detectives Alan Aviles and Mike Stevens were assigned the terrible task of informing the Scott family that Dorothy's remains had been found. They arrived at Jacob and Vera Scott's home on the afternoon of August 9. Jacob answered the door and immediately knew from their expressions that this was significant news. "Have you found her?" Jacob asked before the detectives could speak. "Yes, sir," Detective Aviles said gently. "We've found Dorothy." "I'm very sorry." Vera appeared in the doorway behind Jacob. Is she alive?" The detectives shook their heads. They'd known the question was coming, but it still hurt to answer. "No, ma'am. We've recovered Dorothy's remains. She's been deceased since 1980. We're very sorry for your loss." The Scotts' reaction was complicated. There was grief, certainly, the final confirmation that their daughter was truly gone. But there was also a strange sort of relief. After 4 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe Dorothy was alive somewhere, they finally had certainty. They could finally have closure. They could finally bury their daughter. "Where did you find her?" Jacob asked. The detectives explained about the construction site, about how close it was to where her car had been found. They carefully avoided graphic details about the condition of the remains. The Scotts didn't need to know everything. Some images, once planted, can never be removed. "Did she suffer?" Vera asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We don't believe so," Detective Stevens said, though he couldn't know for sure. "Based on when her watch stopped, we believe she died within an hour or 2 of being taken. It appears to have been quick." This was small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Dorothy hadn't been held captive for days. Hadn't been tortured for extended periods. Her death, while violent and tragic, had been relatively quick. "Do you know who did this?" Jacob asked. The detectives exchanged glances. "We have persons of interest," Detective Aviles said carefully. "The investigation is ongoing. The recovery of Dorothy's remains gives us new avenues to pursue." This was somewhat true and somewhat hopeful. The reality was that after 4 years, the trail was cold. The remains provided confirmation of death but little additional investigative value. The damage from decomposition meant there was no physical evidence to analyze. No DNA that could be recovered. No fibers or hair that could link to a suspect. But the detectives didn't want to tell the family that the case was essentially at a dead end. Let them have hope that justice might still be served. The funeral. Dorothy Jane Scott was finally laid to rest on August 18, 1984, in a cemetery in Orange County. After 4 years, her family could finally have a grave to visit, a place to bring flowers, a physical location to mourn. The funeral was attended by family, friends from church, former coworkers, and several detectives who'd worked the case. It was a somber affair, marked by tears and prayers and the terrible finality of a coffin being lowered into the ground. During the eulogy, the pastor spoke about Dorothy's kindness, her devotion to her son, her faith in God. He spoke about how she tried to help others even when she herself was in danger, driving Conrad to the hospital on that terrible night. Dorothy's life was taken from her, the pastor said. But her spirit, her goodness, lives on in the memories of those who loved her and in the son she left behind. Evil may have taken her from this world, but it could not take who she was. 8-year-old Sean sat between his grandparents, not fully understanding everything being said but understanding that this was goodbye to a mother he barely remembered. He'd seen photos of her, heard stories about her, been told she loved him. But his actual memories were hazy, fragments of a time when he was too young to form lasting memories. The funeral ended. Mourners filed past the grave, dropping flowers, saying final goodbyes. And Dorothy Jane Scott, who had spent 4 years as a missing person and become a mystery that haunted Southern California, was finally at rest. The investigation continues, without progress. The recovery of Dorothy's remains technically reopened the investigation. Detectives reviewed the case file once more, looking for anything that might have been missed in the initial investigation. They re-interviewed Mike Butler, who remained the primary person of interest. Butler, now older and even more reclusive, denied any involvement just as he had 4 years earlier. He had no new information to provide. Without evidence linking him to the crime, he couldn't be charged. Other suspects from the original investigation were recontacted. None provided new information. None confessed. The detectives hit the same wall they'd hit in 1980. They knew approximately what had happened, knew the general profile of who'd done it, but couldn't definitively identify the killer. The case remained officially open but realistically dormant. The killer's silence. Perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the discovery of Dorothy's remains was the killer's reaction to it. Or rather, his lack of reaction. For 4 years, he'd called the Scott family regularly to torment them with the knowledge that he'd taken Dorothy. He'd clearly followed news coverage of the case. He'd wanted attention, wanted recognition for what he'd done. But when Dorothy's remains were discovered and the news covered it extensively, the killer didn't call. There was no final taunting phone call, no gloating that they'd finally found her, no parting message. The silence suggested several possibilities. He was already dead. Perhaps the killer had died in the months since the calls had stopped earlier in 1984. He might have been killed in an accident, died from illness, or committed suicide. If he'd died before the remains were discovered, he couldn't react to the news. He was incarcerated. Maybe the killer was in prison for another crime and couldn't make phone calls to the Scott family. Or he was in prison and chose not to call for fear of finally being traced. He'd moved on psychologically. For years after the murder, the killer's obsession with Dorothy and her family might have faded. The discovery of her body was news, but it didn't trigger the same compulsion to call that he'd felt in the immediate aftermath of the crime. He was afraid. Perhaps the killer realized that calling now, after Dorothy's remains were found, would give police fresh impetus to investigate. New calls might be traced with updated technology. The risk was no longer worth the satisfaction. The truth remains unknown. The killer's identity was never determined, and his motives and psychology remain largely a mystery. The family's long road. For Jacob and Vera Scott, the discovery of Dorothy's remains brought a bittersweet conclusion to their years of torment. They had answers, but not justice. They had closure, but not peace. Jacob Scott became an advocate for victims' families and for missing persons cases. He spoke at community events about Dorothy's case, urging people to report suspicious behavior and to take stalking seriously. He wanted Dorothy's tragedy to mean something, to prevent other families from experiencing what his family had endured. Vera Scott visited Dorothy's grave regularly, bringing flowers, sitting by the headstone, talking to her daughter as if she could hear. Grief counselors would say this is a healthy part of the grieving process, maintaining connection with lost loved ones through ritual and memory. Sean Scott grew up knowing his mother had been murdered but never knowing who'd killed her. As an adult, he would occasionally speak to media about Dorothy's case, hoping that renewed attention might finally lead to answers. But as the years passed, the likelihood of solving the case diminished. Suspects grew older or died. Memories faded. Physical evidence that had been minimal to begin with couldn't be re-examined with newer technology because it simply didn't exist. By the 1990s, Dorothy's case had essentially become a historical cold case, important to her family and to investigators who'd worked it, but no longer actively pursued. Jacob Scott died in 1994, never knowing who killed his daughter. Vera Scott died in 2002, also without answers. Both went to their graves knowing Dorothy's killer had escaped justice. Dorothy Jane Scott has been dead for 45 years as of 2025. Her killer, whoever he was, has almost certainly died as well, either in the years immediately after the murder or in the decades since. Justice, in the traditional sense, will never be served. There will be no arrest, no trial, no conviction, no sentence. The person who took Dorothy's life, who terrorized her family for 4 years with taunting phone calls, who cut a young mother's life short, that person got away with it. This is the reality of cold cases. Not every mystery gets solved. Not every killer faces consequences. Sometimes evil simply escapes accountability. But Dorothy's case isn't just a story of failure. It's also a story of resilience, love, and the importance of never forgetting. What Dorothy's case changed. In 1980, stalking was poorly understood and inadequately addressed by law enforcement. The term stalking hadn't even entered common legal vocabulary. Women like Dorothy who received threatening calls were often told there was nothing police could do until an actual crime occurred. Dorothy's case helped change that. In the years following her murder, California and other states began passing stalking laws that gave law enforcement tools to intervene before stalking escalated to violence. The California Penal Code Section 646.9, the state's stalking law, was passed in 1990. While it came too late for Dorothy, it was influenced by cases like hers, situations where clear warning signs existed but legal mechanisms to protect victims didn't. Dorothy's case also highlighted the importance of taking threats seriously. When someone says, "I'm going to cut you into pieces," that's not a statement to be dismissed or minimized. It's a credible threat that requires immediate intervention. Modern law enforcement training on stalking often includes Dorothy's case as an example of what happens when warning signs are ignored or when victims don't receive adequate protection. The psychological profile. While Dorothy's killer was never identified, his behavior left a clear psychological profile that has been studied by criminal psychologists. He displayed characteristics of erotomania, the delusional belief that he had a romantic relationship with Dorothy when no such relationship existed. This delusion was so strong that he reinterpreted all of Dorothy's actions through the lens of this imaginary relationship. He exhibited sadistic tendencies, not just in killing Dorothy, but in prolonging the suffering of her family through years of taunting phone calls. The calls served no practical purpose for him. They only satisfied his need to inflict psychological pain. He was organized and calculating, able to abduct Dorothy without witnesses clearly seeing him, dispose of her body in a location where it wasn't found for 4 years, burn her car to destroy evidence, and avoid phone traces for 4 years of calls. He was familiar with the Scott family, evidenced by his ability to distinguish Jacob's voice from Vera's over the phone and his choice to only speak to Vera. He likely lived or worked in Orange County. The payphones he used to make calls were scattered across the county, suggesting familiarity with the area. This profile points to someone who was intelligent, local, known to Dorothy at least casually, and deeply psychologically disturbed. But profiles don't solve crimes. They narrow suspect lists, but without physical evidence, even strong suspects can't be charged. The unidentified suspect. In all likelihood, Mike Butler was Dorothy's killer. He fits the profile. He had the opportunity. He knew Dorothy and her family. He lived in an isolated area where a body could be hidden. His behavior when questioned was evasive and suspicious. But, in all likelihood, isn't proof. It's not evidence. It's not enough for a conviction or even an arrest. Butler died without being charged, which means one of two things is true. Either he was guilty and escaped justice through lack of evidence, or he was innocent and spent years under suspicion for a crime he didn't commit. If he was guilty, we can at least take some small comfort in knowing he's no longer a threat. If he wasn't guilty, then the real killer remains unknown, and Butler's reputation was unfairly destroyed by suspicion. We'll never know for certain. For Dorothy's family. Sean Scott is now in his late 40s. His mother has been gone longer than he knew her. He was 4 when she died. He's now been without her for over 40 years. In interviews over the years, Sean has spoken about growing up without answers. About knowing his mother was murdered but not knowing by whom. About visiting her grave and wondering what kind of person she was beyond the stories others told him. "I have more questions than memories," Sean once said. "I know she loved me. I know she was a good person. But I don't remember her voice. I don't remember her hugs. I don't have those things that people take for granted when they grow up with their parents." That loss, not just of Dorothy's life, but of the relationship Sean should have had with his mother, is perhaps the cruelest legacy of her murder. The killer didn't just take Dorothy's future. He took Sean's childhood with his mother. He took decades of memories that should have been made. The cold case reality. Dorothy's case will almost certainly never be officially solved. Too much time has passed. The key suspects are dead. The physical evidence is minimal and degraded. DNA technology that might have helped doesn't have samples to analyze. The case file sits in a storage room somewhere, marked "Cold Case, Unsolved." Occasionally, a new detective might review it, hoping to see something previous investigators missed. But the likelihood of a breakthrough diminishes with each passing year. This is the reality for many cold cases. They don't get the Hollywood ending. They don't get the brilliant detective who sees the clue everyone else missed. They just remain unsolved. Forever. But Dorothy is remembered. In the age of true crime podcasts, YouTube videos, and Reddit investigations, Dorothy's case has found a new audience. Younger generations who weren't alive in 1980 have discovered her story and been moved by it. Online communities dedicated to cold cases regularly discuss Dorothy's disappearance. Amateur investigators review the known facts, propose theories, and keep her case in the public consciousness. This matters. Because as long as people remember Dorothy, as long as her story is told, she isn't truly gone. Her life meant something. Her death demands recognition. Her killer may have escaped earthly justice, but he didn't escape being remembered as a killer. A warning that remains relevant. Dorothy's case reminds us that stalking is not a joke, not an overreaction, not something to be dismissed. When someone receives repeated unwanted contact, when threats are made, when fear is genuine, those situations require immediate and serious intervention. If Dorothy were alive today and reporting the same threats, would the outcome be different? We'd like to think so. Modern stalking laws, better police training, improved phone tracing technology, all of these might have made a difference. But the fundamental challenge remains: stalkers are often difficult to identify until they escalate to violence. And by then, it's often too late. Dorothy's case teaches us to take threats seriously, no matter how unlikely they seem. Dorothy recognized the voice but couldn't place it. That uncertainty didn't make the threat less real. Document everything. Dorothy kept a log of the calls, which became crucial evidence. In the digital age, save texts, emails, screenshots, voicemails. Everything. Trust your instincts. Dorothy knew she was in danger. She took self-defense classes. She was careful. But she also had to live her life, had to work, had to function. That impossible balance is what stalkers exploit. Don't wait for enough evidence. Dorothy's family and friends knew something was wrong. But the system required Dorothy to wait until a crime had been committed. Prevention is worth more than prosecution after the fact. To the person who knows. If you're reading this and you know something about Dorothy Scott's murder, maybe you've suspected someone over the years, maybe you heard something that never seemed important enough to report, maybe you were too afraid to come forward decades ago, understand this. It's not too late. Yes, the killer is almost certainly dead. Yes, there may never be a trial. But Dorothy's son deserves to know. Her family deserves to know. The truth matters, even 45 years later. You can report information anonymously. You can call the Orange County Cold Case Unit. You can reach out through Crime Stoppers. You don't have to identify yourself. If Mike Butler was the killer, confirmation would give the family closure. If it was someone else, identifying them would mean Dorothy's case could finally be marked solved instead of unsolved. The truth is worth telling, even after all these years. For Dorothy. Dorothy Jane Scott was 32 years old when she died. She was a daughter who called her parents daily. A mother who adored her 4-year-old son. A coworker who volunteered to drive someone to the hospital late at night because it was the right thing to do. She was a woman of faith who tried to live according to Christian principles. She was careful without being paranoid. She was kind without being naive. She did everything right, reported the threats, changed her number, took self-defense classes, stayed vigilant. And she was still murdered because someone's delusion told them she belonged to them. Dorothy's death wasn't her fault. It wasn't because she was careless or took unnecessary risks. It was because someone who should have been in psychiatric care or in prison decided that if he couldn't have her, no one could. That's not justice. That's not fair. That's evil, pure and simple. Dorothy Jane Scott deserves to be remembered not as the woman who was stalked and murdered, but as the person she was, a loving mother, a devoted daughter, a helpful coworker, a woman of faith who tried to make the world a little bit better. She helped Conrad Bostrom get medical treatment for a spider bite. She was kind when she could have been indifferent. She showed up when she could have made excuses. And for that kindness, for that willingness to help, she walked into a hospital parking lot and never walked out. The unanswered question. The question that haunts Dorothy's case is simple but profound. How many times did Dorothy unknowingly interact with her killer? How many times did she take a phone call at work from a customer and not realize she was talking to the man who would murder her? How many times did he stand in the shop where she worked, watching her, and she smiled professionally without knowing she was looking at her future killer? Did she help him once with something? Did she answer a question for him? Did she make casual conversation that he reinterpreted as romantic interest? We'll never know. But the tragedy is that Dorothy might have been killed for nothing more than being polite, being professional, doing her job with kindness. If that's the case, if Dorothy's crime was simply treating someone with basic human courtesy that they misinterpreted as love, then her murder becomes even more senseless. The silence that followed. The killer called the Scott family for 4 years. Then suddenly, in 1984, the calls stopped. To this day, no one knows why. Did he die? Was he imprisoned? Did his delusion finally break? Did he simply move on? That silence is, in many ways, more disturbing than the calls were. At least the calls meant there was someone to catch, someone to hold accountable. The silence means he slipped away, became a ghost, disappeared into whatever fate awaited him. And the Scotts were left with questions that would never be answered. Final thoughts. 45 years is a long time. Long enough for the world to change dramatically. In 1980, there were no cell phones, no internet, no DNA databases, no social media. The world Dorothy lived in is almost unrecognizable compared to 2025. But human evil remains constant. The capacity for obsession, for delusion, for violence, those haven't changed. There are still stalkers. Still victims who recognize danger but can't identify it. Still families who lose loved ones to senseless violence. Still killers who escape justice. Dorothy's story isn't just history. It's a warning that remains relevant. It's a reminder that the distance between normal life and tragedy can be measured in minutes, in the time it takes to walk across a parking lot. Dorothy Jane Scott left for work one evening to help a coworker. She never came home. Her son grew up without her. Her parents died without answers. Her killer was never identified. But she is not forgotten. Her name is Dorothy Jane Scott. She was born April 23, 1948. She died May 29, 1980, at approximately 12:30 a.m., somewhere in Orange County, California, at the hands of a killer who loved her in his delusion and hated her in his reality. She was 32 years old. She deserved so much more than what happened to her. And somewhere, in some storage facility or archived record, is information that could tell us who killed her. A file that someone created, a note that someone wrote, a memory that someone carries. The truth is out there. It's been out there for 45 years. If you know something, please tell someone. Dorothy deserves that much. If you have any information about Dorothy Jane Scott's murder, please contact Orange County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit phone, 714-647-7045. Orange County Crime Stoppers phone, 1-855, tip OCCS 1-855-847-6227, website, occrimestoppers.org. All tips can remain anonymous. Dorothy's case may be 45 years old, but information is still valuable. Even if you only have suspicions, even if you think what you know isn't important, please call. Let investigators determine what's relevant. If this case moved you, please subscribe to this channel. We're dedicated to keeping cold cases alive, to giving victims a voice, to demanding justice even decades later. Leave a like to help this video reach more people who might have information. Comment with where you're watching from and share your thoughts on the case. And most importantly, don't forget Dorothy Jane Scott. Don't let her become just another unsolved case. Her family deserves answers. She deserves justice. Thank you for watching. The search for truth continues.